Your Grace. Lord Tywin's voice was impeccably correct. They are bringing in the pie. Your sword is needed. The pie? Joffrey took his queen by the hand. Come, my lady, it's the pie. The guests stood, shouting and applauding, and smashing their wine cups together as the great pie made its slow way down the length of the hall, wheeled along by a half-dozen beaming cooks. 2 yards across it was, crusty and golden brown, and they could hear squeaks and thumpings coming from inside it. Tyrion pulled himself back into his chair. All he needed now was for a dove to shit on him, and his day would be complete. The wine had soaked through his doublet and small clothes, and he could feel the wetness against his skin. He ought to change, but no one was permitted to leave the feast until the time came for the bedding ceremony. That was still a good 20 or 30 dishes off, he judged. King Joffrey and his queen met the pie below the dais. As Joffrey drew his sword, Margaery laid a hand on his arm to restrain him. Widow's wail was not meant for slicing pies. True! Joffrey lifted his voice. Sir Ilyn, your sword! In the shadows at the back of the hall, Sir Ilyn Payne appeared. The spectre at the feast, thought Tyrion as he watched the King's Justice stride forward, gaunt and grim. He had been too young to have known Sir Ilyn before he'd lost his tongue. He would have been a different man in those days, but now the silence is as much a part of him as those hollow eyes, that rusty chainmail shirt, and the great sword on his back. Sir Ilyn bowed before the king and queen, reached back over his shoulder, and drew forth 6 feet of ornate silver bright with runes. He knelt to offer the huge blade to Joffrey, hilt first. Points of red fire winked from the ruby eyes on the pommel. A chunk of dragon glass carved in the shape of a grinning skull. Sansa stirred in her seat. What sword is that? Tyrion's eyes still stung from the wine. He blinked and looked again. Sir Ilyn's great sword was as long and wide as ice, but it was too silvery bright. Valyrian steel had a darkness to it, a smokiness in its soul. Sansa clutched his arm. What has Sir Ilyn done with my father's sword? I should have sent ice back to Robb Stark, Tyrion thought. He glanced at his father, but Lord Tywin was watching the king. Joffrey and Margaery joined hands to lift the great sword and swung it down together in a silvery arc. When the pie crust broke, the doves burst forth in a swirl of white feathers, scattering in every direction, flapping for the windows and the rafters. A roar of delight went up from the benches, and the fiddlers and pipers in the gallery began to play a sprightly tune. Joff took his bride in his arms and whirled her around merrily. A serving man placed a slice of hot pigeon pie in front of Tyrion and covered it with a spoon of lemon cream. The pigeons were well and truly cooked in this pie, but he found them no more appetizing than the white ones fluttering about the hall. Sansa was not eating either. "You're deathly pale, my lady," Tyrion said. "You need a breath of cool air, and I need a fresh doublet." He stood and offered her his hand. "Come." But before they could make their retreat, Joffrey was back. "Uncle, where are you going? You're my cup-bearer, remember?" "I need to change into fresh garb, your grace. May I have your leave?" "No. I like the look of you this way. Serve me my wine." The king's chalice was on the table where he'd left it. Tyrion had to climb back onto his chair to reach it. Joff yanked it from his hands and drank long and deep, his throat working as the wine ran purple down his chin. "My lord," Margaery said, "we should return to our places. Lord Buckler wants to toast us." "My uncle hasn't eaten his pigeon pie." Holding the chalice one-handed, Joffrey jammed his other into Tyrion's pie. "It's ill luck not to eat the pie?" he scolded, as he filled his mouth with hot spice pigeon. "See, it's good." Spitting out flakes of crust, he coughed and helped himself to another fistful. "Dry, though. Needs washing down." Joff took a swallow of wine and coughed again, more violently. "I want to see you ride that pig, Uncle. I want..." His words broke up in a fit of coughing. Marjorie looked at him with concern. "Your Grace? It's the pie, not pie." Joff took another drink, or tried to, but all the wine came spewing back out when another spate of coughing doubled him over. His face was turning red. I can't..." The chalice slipped from his hand, and dark red wine went running across the dais. "He's choking," Queen Marjorie gasped. Her grandmother moved to her side. "Help the poor boy!" The Queen of Thorns screeched in a voice 10 times her size. "Dolts! Will you all stand about gaping? Help your king!" Sir Garland shoved Tyrion aside and began to pound Joffrey on the back. Sir Osmond Kettleblack ripped open the king's collar. A fearful, high, thin sound emerged from the boy's throat, the sound of a man trying to suck a river through a reed. Then it stopped, and that was more terrible still. "Turn him over!" Mace Tyrell bellowed at everyone and no one. "Turn him over and shake him by the hills," a different voice was calling. "Water! Give him some water!" The High Septon began to pray loudly. Grand Maester Pycelle shouted for someone to help him back to his chambers to fetch his potions. Joffrey began to claw at his throat, his nails tearing bloody gouges in the flesh. Beneath the skin, the muscles stood out hard as stone. Prince Tommen was screaming and crying. "He's going to die," Tyrion realized. He felt curiously calm, though pandemonium raged all about him. They were pounding Joff on the back again, but his face was only growing darker. Dogs were barking, children were wailing, men were shouting useless advice at each other. Half the wedding guests were on their feet, some shoving at each other for a better view, others rushing for the doors in their haste to get away. Sir Meryn pried the king's mouth open to jam a spoon down his throat. As he did, the boy's eyes met Tyrion's. He has Jaime's eyes. Only had never seen Jaime look so scared. The boy's only 13. Joffrey was making a dry, clacking noise, trying to speak. His eyes bulged white with terror, and he lifted a hand, reaching for his uncle or pointing. Is he begging my forgiveness, or does he think I can save him? "No!" Cersei wailed. "Father, help him! Someone help him! My son! My son!" Tyrion found himself thinking of Robb Stark. My own wedding is looking much better in hindsight. He looked to see how Sansa was taking this, but there was so much confusion in the hall that he could not find her. But his eyes fell on the wedding chalice, forgotten on the floor. He went and scooped it up. There was still a half-inch of deep purple wine in the bottom of it. Tyrion considered it for a moment, then poured it on the floor. Marjorie Tyrell was weeping in her grandmother's arms as the old lady said, "Be brave, be brave." Most of the musicians had fled, but one last flautist in the gallery was blowing a dirge. In the rear of the throne room, scuffling had broken out around the doors, and the guests were trampling on each other. Sir Adam's gold cloaks moved in to restore order. Guests were rushing headlong out into the night, some weeping, some stumbling and retching, others white with fear. It occurred to Tyrion belatedly that it might be wise to leave himself. When he heard Cersei scream, he knew that it was over. I should leave. Now. Instead, he waddled toward her. His sister sat in a puddle of wine, cradling her son's body. Her gown was torn and stained, her face white as chalk. A thin black dog crept up beside her, sniffing at Joffrey's corpse. The boy is gone, Cersei, Lord Tywin said. He put his gloved hand on his daughter's shoulder as one of his guardsmen shooed away the dog. Unhand him now. Let him go. She did not hear. It took 2 King's Guard to pry loose her fingers, so the body of King Joffrey Baratheon could slide limp and lifeless to the floor. The High Septon knelt beside him. Father above, judge our good King Joffrey justly, he intoned, beginning the prayer for the dead. Marjorie Tyrell began to sob, and Tyrion heard her mother, Lady Aleri, say, "He choked, sweetling. He choked on the pie. It was naught to do with you. He choked. We all saw." He did not choke. Cersei's voice was sharp as Sir Ilyn's sword. My son was poisoned. She looked to the White Knight standing helplessly around her. King's Guard, do your duty. My lady, said Sir Loras Tyrell, uncertain. Arrest my brother, she commanded him. He did this, the dwarf, him, and his little wife. They killed my son, your king. Take them. Take them both.